kind of got kicked off when we managed to sequence the first ancient human genome.
It took 6 years. It took the best geneticists in the world, and it took 400 skeletons to solve this puzzle. We finally decoded the Viking genome, and the results? They are disturbing. The DNA proves that our image of the Viking world is a total fantasy, but it goes deeper. There is a ghost DNA present in these samples that hints at a lost connection to the East.
The Viking period, we can see, is, it's characterized by an enormous interest in the world.
We are about to open the files on a genetic mystery that suggests the Vikings were the first true global citizens, or the first global imposters. The genetic anomaly in the North. So here's the deal. We have all seen the movies. You know the type. The guy with the long blonde hair, blue eyes, maybe a horned helmet, looking like he just walked out of a gym in modern-day Sweden. That is the image we have been sold for hundreds of years. It is on our TV shows, in our comic books, and even in our sports teams. But science just threw a massive curveball at that entire idea. A massive team of researchers just wrapped up a 6-year study. This wasn't some small weekend project. This was a deep dive. They sequenced the genomes of over 400 Viking skeletons. These remains were scattered all over Europe and Greenland. They wanted to know the truth about the people who terrorized the coastlines from the year 800 to the year 1050. And get this, the results were published in the famous journal Nature, so you know this is the real deal. They started with a woman named Kata. Her skeleton was found at a Viking burial site in Varnum, Sweden. Now, normally you dig up a Viking in Sweden, you expect Viking DNA. But when they ran the sequence on Kata and hundreds of others, the data didn't match the story. The first big shock? The hair. Everyone assumes Vikings were blonde. It is the classic stereotype. The Nordic ideal. But the DNA analysis showed that many of these Vikings actually had brown hair. They didn't look like the Nordic gods we see in Hollywood. They looked different. They looked darker. They looked more complex. But hair color is just the tip of the iceberg. The study leader, Professor Eska Willerslev, said that genetically, the Viking world was not what we thought. We have this image of a tight-knit group of Scandinavians who are all related, going out on raiding parties together. We think of them as a specific race of people, a master race of warriors. The DNA says absolutely not. The study found that Vikings were mixing with locals way more than anyone realized. They had a much more diverse background. It wasn't just people from Norway, Denmark, and Sweden keeping to themselves. It was a melting pot. Here's where it gets crazy. The researchers found genetic influences from Southern Europe. They even found genetic markers from Asia. And the wildest part, this foreign DNA didn't just show up because Vikings brought people back as captives. This DNA was already there. The gene flow from the south and the east happened before the Viking Age even really started. This completely shatters the idea of the pure Scandinavian Viking. It changes the perception of who a Viking actually was. No one could have predicted that significant gene flows were entering Scandinavia from thousands of miles away back then. Think about that for a second. We are talking about a time before planes, before trains, before easy travel. Yet somehow, genes from Asia were making their way into the Viking bloodline. It means the world was way more connected than we give it credit for. It implies that Scandinavia wasn't this isolated, frozen wasteland of pure warriors. It was a hub. It was a transit zone. But why does this matter? Because it redefines the word Viking. It proves that Viking wasn't a genetic definition. It wasn't about your blood. It was about your job. It was a profession. And if it was a profession, that means anyone could apply. This opens up a massive can of worms regarding their society. If they weren't a unified race, how did they stay so organized? How did they conquer half the known world if they were a mix of Southern Europeans, Asians, and Scandinavians? The answer might lie in their social structure. They were meritocratic. If you could fight, you were in. The DNA doesn't lie. It shows a society that was far more open to outsiders than we ever imagined. But it also raises a dark question. If they were mixing so much, why do we have this strong memory of them being blonde and blue-eyed? Is it possible that the blonde Viking was actually the minority, the ruling class? Or maybe just a myth we invented later to make them seem more godlike? The study even suggests that the different regions of Scandinavia were isolated from each other. We always group them together. The Vikings. But the DNA shows that Vikings from Norway weren't mixing with Vikings from Sweden. They were rivals. They were distinct populations. This means the Viking Age wasn't one big invasion. It was a series of separate, uncoordinated attacks from different genetic groups who just happened to use similar technology. It's like realizing that the different mafia families in New York weren't actually working together. They were just using the same tactics. But if the Swedish Vikings weren't mixing with the Norwegians, who were they mixing with? This is where the Asian DNA becomes the smoking gun. The Swedish Vikings were heading east. They were hitting the rivers of Russia. They were meeting the traders of the Silk Road, and they brought something back with them. Not just silver, not just silk. They brought back genes, but wait until you hear about the imposters found in Scotland. How the Picts became the pirates. Okay, let's dig into this Scottish mystery because this is where the not entirely human idea starts to make sense. Not in a sci-fi way, but in a cultural way. The idea of Viking was a virus and it was spreading. We always assumed Viking was something you were born as. You were born in Norway, you were a Viking. Simple, right? It's not that simple, though. The researchers looked at two specific skeletons found in Orkney, Scotland. These guys were buried with respect. They had Viking swords. They were laid to rest in a way that screamed warrior of the North. They were buried in the boat style, a classic Viking tradition meant to carry the soul to Valhalla. For decades, archaeologists looked at them and said, yep, those are invaders from Scandinavia. But the DNA results came back and they were a 0% match for Scandinavia. 0. These guys were locals. They were genetically similar to present-day Irish and Scottish people. They might have even been Picts, the mysterious painted people of ancient Scotland. Yet they lived and died as Vikings. This brings up a huge realization. Viking wasn't an ethnicity. It was a franchise. It is like seeing someone today wearing a Yankees hat. It doesn't mean they play for the Yankees. It doesn't even mean they are from New York. It just means they subscribe to the brand. Professor Søren Sindbæk, an archaeologist from Denmark who worked on the study, said that the Viking identity was not limited to people with Scandinavian blood. These Scottish locals saw the Vikings coming. They saw the power, they saw the technology, and they said, I want in on that. They took on the lifestyle. They took on the beliefs. They probably spoke the language and used the weapons. But genetically, they were completely different. This completely flips the script on the history of the British Isles. We usually think of it as Vikings versus locals, the invaders against the defenders. But this evidence suggests it was much more fluid. The locals were joining the invaders. They were becoming them. It implies that the Viking phenomenon was a socio-political movement, not just a genetic invasion. They exported ideas. They exported technology. And clearly they exported a brand that was so cool, even their enemies wanted to join the club. But while the locals in Scotland were playing dress-up as Vikings back in the south of England, things were getting brutal. This brings us to the headless men of Dorset. In Dorset, in the United Kingdom, archaeologists found a mass grave. Now, mass graves are never good news, but this one was specific. It contained around 50 skeletons, but something was missing. All of them, they were headless. This was a massacre. These weren't warriors who fell in the heat of battle. The angle of the cuts on the neck bones suggests they were captured, tied up, and executed one by one. They were eliminated. Some of the remains from this site were used in this massive DNA study, and what they found adds a tragic layer to the story. These men were Vikings. The DNA confirms it. But they weren't just random raiders, they were a crew. They were likely a raiding party that got caught by the locals, probably the Anglo-Saxons, and they paid the ultimate price. It paints a brutal picture of the Viking Age. We often glorify the raids. We think of them burning villages and taking gold. But here we see the other side of the coin. We see a failed expedition. We see 50 men, probably brothers and cousins, lined up and ended miles from home. But here is the crazy part. The DNA from these headless men showed that they were all from different places in Scandinavia. They weren't a family unit, they were a recruited crew. This supports the idea that Viking crews were like pirate ships. You recruited the best men you could find regardless of exactly which village they came from, as long as they were in your region. This also ties into a wild historical theory known as the St. Brice's Day Massacre. In the year 1002, the English king Ethelred the Unready ordered the elimination of all Danes in England. Was this mass grave the result of that order? The DNA suggests the timeline fits. But think about the diversity again. If these crews were recruiting from all over and locals were joining in, the Viking army was basically the Foreign Legion of the Dark Ages. It was a multicultural force of destruction. And this diversity might explain why they were so successful. They weren't stuck in one way of thinking. They adapted. They absorbed. If they met a culture with better swords, they took the swords. If they met a culture with better maps, they took the maps. And if they met a culture with stronger genes, they took the genes. This leads us to the Eastern Front. While the Danes were getting decapitated in England, the Swedes were doing something entirely different in Russia. They were building an empire that would eventually lead to one of the wildest theories in history. Did the Vikings actually become the bodyguards of the emperor? Did Vikings meet the Mongols? So we established that Vikings weren't a unified group. The Danes went west. The Norwegians went northwest. But the Swedes? The Swedes went east. And this is where the Asian DNA connection really starts to sparkle. The study showed that the Swedish Vikings had a completely different genetic trajectory. They weren't just raiding, they were trading. They sailed their long ships across the Baltic Sea and entered the massive river systems of what is now Russia and Ukraine. They went down the Dnieper. They went down the Volga. They called themselves the Rus. Does that name sound familiar? It should. It is where the word Russia comes from. That's right. The DNA suggests that the founders of the Russian state were actually Vikings. But here is where the wild theory comes in. How far east did they go? We know they reached Constantinople. We know they reached Baghdad. There are Viking runes carved into the Hagia Sophia in Turkey. 10 literally, graffiti that says Halfdan was here. But the genetic markers from Asia found in the skeletons suggest they might have gone even further. Or someone came to them. Imagine the Silk Road. It was the superhighway of the ancient world. Spices, silk, and people moving from China to Europe. The Vikings positioned themselves right at the end of that highway. The study found Asian genes in Viking Age Scandinavia. This implies that traders from the east, maybe people from the steppes, maybe ancestors of the Mongols, were coming up those rivers and mixing with the Vikings. This creates a fascinating image. A Viking warrior standing in a market in Kiev, trading furs for Arab silver and standing next to a merchant from Central Asia. This mixing of bloodlines might explain the berserker rage. Okay, this is a bit out there, but stick with me. There is a theory that the famous berserker rage, where Vikings would go into a trance-like fury, feeling no pain, wasn't just about eating magic mushrooms. Some researchers speculate it could have been a genetic trait, a mutation. And where do distinct genetic traits come from? Hybridization. When two distinct populations mix, like the sturdy Scandinavians and the resilient people of the Asian steppe, you sometimes get hybrid vigor. You get new traits. Could the legendary strength and endurance of the Vikings be a result of this not entirely human, in the sense of not entirely Scandinavian DNA cocktail? It is a possibility that the genetic data is just now hinting at. And let's talk about the Varangian Guard. In Constantinople, the Byzantine emperor didn't trust his own people to guard him. He wanted warriors who were loyal only to money and had no local politics. So he hired Vikings. These were the Varangian Guard, the elite of the elite. They carried massive axes. They were huge, and they were genetically diverse. If you were a Viking in the Varangian Guard, you were living in the center of the world. You were mixing with Greeks, Turks, Africans, and Asians. And then, after your service was done, you went back home to Sweden, and you brought your new family with you. This explains why the study found Southern European DNA in Scandinavia. It wasn't an invasion from the South, it was the Vikings bringing the South home with them. They were importing the world to the North. But this creates a paradox. If they were so open to the world, why did their culture eventually collapse? The DNA study shows that this massive influx of foreign genes happened before and during the Viking Age. But then, it stopped. Around the year 1050, the genetic door slammed shut. The mixing ended. The Vikings disappeared and the modern Scandinavian nations were born. But before they disappeared, they did something that is still the subject of the biggest controversy in history. They looked west. Further west than England, further west than Iceland. They looked at the Atlantic Ocean and they decided to cross it. And this is where the theories get really wild. Did they leave their DNA in the Americas 500 years before Columbus? The answer might be hidden in a controversial stone in Minnesota. Sunstones and alien navigation. We know they reached Newfoundland. We have the archaeological site at Lands O Meadows. That is a fact, but a lot of people think that was just a base camp, a pit stop. The wild theory is that they went much, much further. There are stories, legends really, about white gods or bearded men arriving in the Americas long before the Spanish. For years, these were dismissed as myths. But now that we know the Vikings were genetically diverse and had Asian DNA, it makes you wonder about their navigation capabilities. How did they navigate the open ocean? They didn't have magnetic compasses. One theory is the sunstone, a crystal that could locate the sun even on a cloudy day by polarizing light. It sounds like magic or advanced tech. Some people even go as far as to say it borders on ancient alien technology. But let's stick to the ground for a second. If they had this tech and they had this diverse genetic background that made them adaptable, could they have sailed down the coast of America? There is a controversial artifact called the Kensington Runestone found in Minnesota. It supposedly tells the story of Swedish and Norwegian Vikings deep in North America in the year 1362. Most historians call it a fake, a hoax. But with this new DNA evidence showing how far the Vikings actually traveled and how much they mixed, some people are taking a second look. If Vikings from Sweden could carry Asian DNA back home, could Vikings from Norway have left European DNA in Native American populations? So far, the large-scale DNA studies haven't found a Viking gene in pre-Columbian Native Americans. But absence of evidence isn't evidence of absence. We might just be looking in the wrong place. Or maybe the gene flow went the other way. Imagine a Viking ship returning from Vinland, America, not with gold, but with people. If they brought Native Americans back to Iceland or Norway, their DNA would have been absorbed into the population. There is actually a specific genetic sequence found in Iceland called the C1e lineage. It is a mitochondrial DNA type. It is usually found in Native Americans and Asians, and it is found in a few Icelandic families. How did it get there? The official explanation is recent migration or Asian heritage, but the timeline suggests it arrived centuries ago. Could this be the smoking gun? Did a Viking bring a Native American woman back to Iceland in the year 1000? It is the only logical explanation that fits the wild Viking narrative. And then there is the Amazon theory. This is the wildest of them all. Some researchers point to ancient depictions in South America of bearded men. Teen Vikings had beards. It is a loose connection, sure, but consider the Amazon River. We know the Vikings were masters of river navigation. They conquered Russia by river. Why couldn't they conquer the Amazon? It sounds impossible. But remember, we just found out they had Asian genes before they even had a word for Viking. We just found out Scots became Vikings. We just found out they were genetically distinct groups acting as a franchise. If they could reach Baghdad, why is the Amazon so crazy? But let's pivot to something even stranger. The mythology. Norse mythology is full of wars between two groups of gods, the Aesir and the Vanir. The Aesir were the war gods, Odin, Thor. The Vanir were the nature gods, Freya, Frey. For years, scholars thought this was just a story, but what if it is a cultural memory of a genetic event? What if the Vanir were the original inhabitants of Scandinavia, the ones with the Southern European DNA? And the Aesir were the invaders, the ones with the Asian steppe DNA? The war between the Aesir and Vanir ends with them mixing spit to create a new being, a truce, a mixing of blood. This matches the DNA study almost perfectly. The Viking genome is a result of these different groups clashing and then mixing. The mythology isn't just a story, it is a history of their DNA. It means that when you read about Thor, you aren't reading about a god. You are reading about a genetic takeover. But eventually, the party had to end. The study indicates that the gene flow stopped. The diverse, multicultural world of the Vikings solidified into the modern nations of Denmark, Sweden, and Norway. Why? Maybe the church cracked down on the importing of people. Maybe the borders hardened. Or maybe the Viking energy just burned itself out. But the DNA didn't disappear. It just went into hiding. And that brings us to the final, and perhaps most personal, question. The modern Viking paradox. So, let's bring this home. What does all this digging in the dirt mean for us today? The researchers didn't just look at old bones, they compared the ancient DNA to modern people. They wanted to see how much of that Viking bloodline survived 1,000 years of history. The results are pretty staggering. If you live in the United Kingdom today, there is a solid chance you are part Viking. The study estimates that up to 6% of the population in the UK carries significant Viking DNA. That is millions of people walking around with the genetic code of a raider in their cells. You might be an accountant, or a teacher, or a nurse, but deep down, your cells remember the North Sea. But in Sweden, the number is even higher, 10%. Now you might say only 10%, I thought Swedes were 100% Viking. That's the point. That's the big reveal. Modern-day Scandinavians are actually genetically different from their Viking ancestors. The gene pool has changed so much over the last 1,000 years. The specific Viking markers, those unique combinations of Scandinavian, Southern European, and Asian genes, have faded or shifted. Professor Willerslev said it best. The history books will need to be updated. We can't look at a modern Swedish person and say that is exactly what a Viking looked like. Evolution, migration, and time have blurred the lines. This study also debunks the idea of the pure ancestry that some groups try to claim. You know, there are people out there who obsess over Viking heritage as a symbol of purity, but science just proved that the Vikings were the opposite of pure. They were the ultimate mongrels of the medieval world. They were a mix of everything they touched. They were successful precisely because they were diverse. They absorbed people. They absorbed cultures. They absorbed DNA. Think about the two skeletons in Orkney again, the locals who became Vikings. That is the real legacy. It wasn't about blood, it was about the mindset. It was about the technology of the ships. It was about the socio-political structure. The Viking was a phenomenon that swept across the world, and it didn't care about your genetic background. If you could swing a sword and row a boat, you were in. This research also sheds light on the sheer scale of their travel. We mentioned Leif Erikson being the first European in North America. The DNA backs up this restless spirit. They moved from what is now Denmark to England, from Norway to Ireland, Scotland, Iceland, and Greenland, from Sweden to the Baltics. They were the internet of the Dark Ages. They connected the world. But there is one final twist. The study shows that after the Viking Age ended around the year 1050, something strange happened to the DNA flow. It stopped. But then, something changed. Just as quickly as it began, the massive influx of foreign genes into Scandinavia suddenly dried up. The genetic floodgates slammed shut. The mixing slowed down to a crawl, and the borders, both physical and genetic, closed tight. Why? What stopped the most mobile people on Earth? Maybe it was the cross replacing the hammer. The spread of Christianity brought new rules, frowning upon the brutal slave trade and the raiding culture that had fueled this genetic melting pot. Maybe it was the formation of strict kingdoms. Jarls became kings, and open frontiers became guarded borders. The wild, free-roaming mix-and-match world of the Vikings came to an end. The word Viking ceased to be a job description, a thing you did, and became a memory, a legend to be written down by monks who hated them. But here's the thing about the past. It never truly stays buried. Those bones in the ground, they remember everything. They remember the brutal reality that the sagas gloss over. They remember the execution pits of headless men in Dorset, men who traveled thousands of miles only to die in the mud. They remember the woman named Kata in Sweden, buried with high honors, who wasn't genetically Swedish at all. They remember the Scottish imposters who picked up a sword and adopted the Viking lifestyle because it paid better than farming. And perhaps most shockingly, they remember the strange traces of Asian genes that traveled all the way from the Silk Road to the icy shores of Norway. We are only just scratching the surface of what DNA can tell us. Science is effectively rewriting the history books, page by page. Every time we sequence a genome from an ancient grave, we find a new mystery. We find that humans have always been movers, shakers, and mixers. We don't stay put. This study destroys the Victorian idea of the Viking. It proves that the Vikings weren't a separate elite species. They weren't entirely human in the sense that they were some isolated, perfect, blonde-haired tribe protected from the rest of the world. They were something much more real than that. They were a mess. They were a chaotic, violent, adventurous, mixing mess of genes and cultures. They were a sponge that soaked up DNA from everywhere they raided, traded, and settled. And honestly, that is what makes them so fascinating. They are a mirror of us. They represent the chaos of human history. So the next time you see a Viking in a movie or a TV show or a video game, remember this study. Don't just look at the axes and the longships. Look closer. Remember that under that iron helmet, there might be brown hair, not blonde. Running through those veins might be DNA from the sunny Mediterranean or the steppes of Russia. That warrior screaming a battle cry might actually be a local Scot pretending to be a conqueror. So what do you think? Does the idea that Vikings were a multicultural genetic mix ruin the fantasy for you, or does it make them even more impressive as a global force? And seriously, do you think the Vanir versus Aesir war was actually a genetic clash? I want to hear your wildest theories in the comments. If you enjoyed this deep dive into the DNA of the past, smash that like button and subscribe. See you in the next mystery.